Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for having me here today. I'm going to start off by giving you a choice. And I understand that the group organizing this today is actually going to pay out to all of you on this. So, would you prefer a certain $6 or a 25% chance of $32? Okay, so raise your hand if you would prefer $6. Okay? And that looks to be just about half. So in my lab, I've run about 2,000 people through experiments where we ask them questions like this. And what we found is that, by and large, most people at this question will choose the $6 because, essentially, they hate the uncertainty. If they were to do the math, which some of you probably did, you'd have figured out the expected value of the gamble is actually $8, which is worth more than the 6, clearly. However, you're doing something else to it. You're discounting it farther because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. Now, if you had 10,000 of these, it's very clear that you should always choose the gamble because, law of large numbers, you're going to make a lot more money. But we don't do that. And the question is, essentially, why don't we? So this is where luck comes in for me. Because what we're trying to do with luck is essentially alter physics. Okay, we will have special clothing that we find that helps our local sports team, or we'll carry around pieces of dead animals or dead plants, shoes that belong to some horse, or even lucky cats. And what we're really trying to do there is we're trying to change the probabilities or the physics of the world. We're trying to say, well, for me, it's not a 25% chance, it's actually a 35% chance. And if I feel lucky, then I'm going to take that gamble. So what I want to suggest today is the idea of redefining luck. We don't really want to think about it as the idea of altering physics, because we cannot do that. Instead, what we should do is think about it in terms of making better choices. And we need to understand what we actually do in our choices, not just the theoretical models of how should we choose. Because for the most part, we don't do that unless we're dealing with a mortgage choice or some kind of really complicated, important choice. So I'm going to start off talking about some of the experiments I've done in my lab where we're looking at the questions of how different bodily states alter the way in which we actually make choices. And I'm going to talk about two different ways that we make choices. The first is uncertainty preference, which is the idea of, the way I'm defining it here is how much are you affected by not knowing the outcome. So how much are you preferring the certain option over the gamble? And then the other one is a strategy, which is what information are you using? Are you using the best information, or are you using bad information in order to make your choice? And I apologize, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there's just not time in this venue. So first, we've looked at sleep deprivation, and what we find is that sleep deprivation does not alter your uncertainty preference, but it does diminish your use of information. In aging, we find that as you get older, you're actually less affected by uncertainty, but your ability to use the information also goes down. With cognitive fatigue, we find, so this is 2.5 hours of a hard mental effort. You end up without any significant changes in either of these, but a great increase in your variation. And looking at individual levels of testosterone in both men and women, we find that people that have the average testosterone in their gender are most affected by uncertainty, and that's actually people that are lower or higher that are less affected by uncertainty, which is different from the common belief of the idea that if you have more testosterone, you're more risk-seeking, that you're going to be more likely to take a gamble. And finally, serotonin, where we actually found no effects, contrary to what some others are suggesting. So what I want to do now is you can think of those as long-term states, meaning this is something you get into and it can last for a couple of hours or a couple of days. Like if you're sleep deprived until you get more sleep, until you can catch up. And what I want to talk about now is actually looking in the brain at much shorter time periods. Okay? So in collaboration with a friend of mine from graduate school, Pojang Si, and his postdocs, Evan Huang and Soon, what we did was we set up an experiment where we had people go into the fMRI scanner and they were answering questions like that gamble one I gave you to begin with, And they did about 140 of these, and they did it about 1 every 20 seconds. So they'd have a long gap, and then they'd see one and they'd make a choice. Long gap, see one, make a choice. And what we wanted to know is what brain regions have information that is predictive of your choice before you actually see the options. Okay, so this is what brain regions are being altered and controlled, or have this information about your state before you even know what your options are. So for each trial, we looked and said, what did they choose? And we can look at this as, did you choose the gamble or the certain option? And we can also look at this, did they respond with the right hand or the left hand? Because we wanted to make sure that we weren't just picking up motor activity. Okay, and so when we do this, what we find are these two regions. So right here in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and also down in the striatum, were two locations that had information, and actually stretching out 6 seconds before you saw the options, we could predict what choices you were going to make. Which is, in a sense, you could think, well, that's miraculous. But at the same time, if you have some kind of a fluctuation in your brain, and your brain is controlling your decisions, then we expect that we can find that, and that we can actually reflect this. Okay, so the next experiment I want to talk about is a little bit different. So rather than going through and looking at what region has information about something, we want to actually alter that initial state and then see how we can change, see what brain region is responsible for changes in behavior. And we chose to do this under the decision-making domain of moral judgment. And so we had people read through 40 different stories where, here's an example one, you're making a choice between, so they read through a whole vignette. And essentially the vignette here, this example, is you are the sole pilot on a plane. There's 5 other passengers. And while you're flying, you realize that you don't have enough gas to get to where you're going. You do some quick calculations, and you estimate that if you were to push out one of the passengers, you would have enough fuel to make it to the place where you're going. Your alternative is to just do nothing, and the plane will crash and everyone will die. So then we ask them, how morally acceptable is it to push one person out of the plane? And we always phrase these in the how morally acceptable is it to do something that is deontologically considered bad in order to achieve a good utilitarian outcome. And so prior to each of these vignettes, the people were primed within a face. And the faces were either of neutral expression or they had a disgust expression. Okay, so you can see on this woman the disgust expression on the left and the neutral on the right. And these priming was done with presentations of 14 milliseconds so that the people were actually not aware of having seen the face. Okay? Yet that still produced changes in their moral judgments. So when we take a look at how sensitive, so when we look at the change, in the average difference in the moral judgment across the different vignette types, based upon how sensitive are you to disgust as measured on another survey, what we see is that the more sensitive someone is, the more they're affected by it, as well as less sensitive, altering them in the other direction. Okay, so armed with this, where essentially we have a measure of something about the person, their trait, sensitivity to disgust stimuli, and the way in which they're affected by these in terms of moral judgment, we then went to look in the brain to try and find out, to understand what systems in the brain are responsible for this. And what we found was very similar in some sense to the regions that we were finding in the earlier study, where it was these dorsomedial prefrontal cortex regions and other anterior prefrontal cortex components that had activity that accounted for the change in moral judgment. And what this is suggesting is really that small microstates are able to have very significant impacts on the decisions that we're making. And we took this one step further. We chose a small region there, and we did functional connectivity to look at what areas are feeding in signals, potentially, to this to cause the behavioral change. And then we selected a region from here, and we found a connection back to the trait discuss sensitivity. So what this suggests, if we were to invert this, and the causality is not here, this is all correlational, but the story that this suggests is essentially that we have a region which, as you are presented with the emotional expression, is modulating, that is essentially is receiving this signal, doing your evaluation of it, and altering the frontal areas actually involved in making the decision, producing the final behavioral change. Okay, well, what I've tried to express is essentially the ideas that we should not consider luck as something about changing physics. But what I don't want to say is that we should consider that luck is in the brain. Because it's true that the brain has some stochastic processes, but the brain is a massively good information processing device. But it's highly sensitive to the environment and our current states. So in order to make good decisions, what we have to do is understand how these different states affect us, not just as a whole, but individually, and we have to be aware of what state we're currently in order to do this. And so that's why I think that we should consider this essentially as looking at, I think that we should consider this not just, think of luck not in terms of just changing physics, but more in terms of making sure that we are making the best decisions that we can and we understand our decision processes. And as a neuroscientist, the key piece here is that we are making great advances in understanding what parts of the brain are doing this and how these will help us, in the end, understand more about who, as humans, we actually are. Okay. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you to everyone in my lab.